Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. This week's video is the second part in a two-part series where we examine whether the CCRC's approach in Mr. Malkinson's case, heavily criticised by Mr. LKC in a report released last July, could also be relevant to two other cases under its review. Our initial question was, could the cases of Jeremy Bamber and Jason Moore, instances where the CCRC's superficial and insufficiently curious approach, as identified by Mr. LKC, is once again evident? In the first part, we discussed Jeremy Bamber's case. In this second part, we will delve into the case of Jason Moore. We suggest watching the first part if you haven't already, as it provides background information. Let me start by noting that our usual disclaimer about not intending to cause any distress to the original victims is not needed in this instance. In fact, we are confident that the original victims will endorse our examination of this case. As we will reveal later in this video, they themselves stand behind Mr. Moore's claims of innocence. So stick with us until the end to learn more. So let's start by examining the tragic facts of the event that led to Jason Moore's conviction. On the 24th of August 2005, Robert Darby, a 42-year-old man, was stabbed at the car park of the Valentine, a pub in Gants Hill, East London, and died of his injuries in hospital the following day. Jason Moore and Martin Power were charged with his murder in 2012. The delay in proceeding with the trial was due to Mr. Moore and Mr. Power fleeing abroad immediately after the event. As always, let's begin with the prosecution case. The prosecution case was that Mr. Moore had stabbed Mr. Darby and Mr. Power had aided him by driving him in his car from and to the murder scene. Mr. Power was charged with murder by way of joint enterprise. The motive had been that Mr. Moore had started a friendship with Mr. Darby's former partner, and this had not been taken very well by Mr. Darby. Mr. Darby's former partner testified that in the days leading to the murder, Mr. Darby had visited her several times, complaining of her relationship with Mr. Moore and even threatened her, which caused her to contact the police. On the day of the murder, she found her car smeared with milk and tomato sauce. She also testified that Mr. Darby followed her to her workplace and smashed into her car. She said his behavior had been erratic. These events were corroborated and consistent with the telephone evidence. CCTV footage from the road adjacent to the Valentine pub showed on the day of the murder the arrival of Mr. Darby's car first and then the arrival of Mr. Power's car. The prosecution case relied entirely on eyewitness testimony, particularly from the only witness who later identified Mr. Moore as the passenger in Mr. Power's car, but only on his second attempt and a good 7 years after the event. He was interviewed just a few hours after the incident. He stated that at the time of the murder, he was on the road of the Valentine pub searching for a location where he was expected to attend a meeting. While near the Valentine pub, he observed a black BMW stopped on the road and a silver BMW that pulled up behind it shortly after. He claimed to have seen both occupants of the silver BMW, exiting their car and approaching the black BMW. Meanwhile, the driver of the black BMW had also exited his vehicle. He witnessed the stabbing but gave inconsistent accounts in his various statements regarding his location at the time when the event occurred. He admitted having doubts about who actually stabbed men, as the incident happened very quickly, he said. However, he did see the passenger of the silver BMW holding a knife as he exited the car, while the driver's hands were obscured from his view. The defense suggested whether the passenger could in fact be holding a newspaper. The witness then saw the stabbed man walk towards the car park entrance, where he collapsed. He did not know where the other two and their car went afterwards. He also mentioned seeing a car parked in the lot occupied by a woman who also witnessed the event, although he noticed the car only after the stabbing took place. A month later, he partook in an identification procedure. By then, both defendants had fled the country, so he was shown two videos. In the first video, which included a photo of Mr. Moore, he failed to pick Mr. Moore up and identified a volunteer instead, stating that he was confident he had been the stabber. And in the second video, which had a photo of Mr. Power, he failed to identify anyone. He, however, identified Mr. Moore as the passenger of the silver BMW in a subsequent identification procedure 7 years later in 2012, after Mr. Moore had returned to the UK and a fresh photo was taken of him. The lady he saw in the car park was most likely the second witness. She said that in fact she was not parked, but rather that she had approached the location and drove past the black BMW while the altercation was taking place. She saw three men, which she referred as men 1 as Mr. Darby, men 2 as Mr. Moore, and men 3 as Mr. Power. She did not see the stabbing or a knife. However, she said she saw a push from men 2, Mr. Moore, towards men 1, Mr. Darby. After the push, men 1, Mr. Darby, ran towards the pub and collapsed shortly afterwards. She also partook in an identification procedure but failed to identify anyone. Finally, while neither of the two eyewitnesses mentioned a passenger in the black BMW, a man who was a friend of Mr. Darby testified at trial that he had been in the passenger seat when the incident occurred. He stated that he and Mr. Darby had planned to go out for something to eat. But on the way, Mr. Darby decided to stop and look for a car outside the Valentine pub. After Mr. Darby got out of the car, he reclined his seat and fell asleep. When he woke up, he noticed that Mr. Darby was missing, so he drove the car to the pub's car park, where he found Mr. Darby on the ground, and when he noticed that Mr. Darby was holding a Stanley knife, in a panic he took the knife and threw it behind a fence. Mr. Moore's defense was outlined in a statement he gave to the police in 2012 upon his return to the UK. He explained that he had fled the country out of fear of being implicated in the stabbing and had received serious threats from associates of the deceased. According to his statement, on the day of the incident, Mr. Power, who knew Mr. Darby, was acting as an intermediary for Mr. Moore in an attempt to calm Mr. Darby, who was enraged over Mr. Moore's friendship with his former partner. Mr. Power had learned that morning that Mr. Darby had threatened his girlfriend, which reportedly made him furious. He and Mr. Moore drove to the Valentine pub, and when Mr. Power saw Mr. Darby's car, he got out. Mr. Power saw that Mr. Darby had a knife. When Mr. Darby launched at Power with the knife, Mr. Moore exited the car. In the meantime, Mr. Darby ran towards the pub and Mr. Moore noticed that Mr. Power had sustained injuries to his ear. He did not witness how Mr. Darby sustained his injuries, but was not aware at the time that they were life-threatening. They drove away immediately afterwards. It was only later that Mr. Moore learned of the seriousness of Mr. Darby's injuries, which prompted him and Mr. Power to flee the country following threats. Mr. Power's defense, on the other hand, was that during the confrontation, Mr. Darby had struck him on the head, rendering him unconscious. And when he regained consciousness, Mr. Moore ordered him to drive off, and so he did. Neither of them testified of having witnessed Mr. Darby being stabbed. On the 18th of December 2013, a trial in the Central Criminal Court resulted with Martin Power being acquitted while Jason Moore was convicted. He was sentenced on the 23rd of December 2013 to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. Jason Moore has always protested his innocence. In 2017, he applied for an extension of time for permission to appeal out of time against his conviction and for permission to adduce fresh evidence under Section 23 of the Criminal Appeal Act 1968. A single judge referred his application to the full Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal heard the fresh evidence de beneas. This means that the evidence is heard subject to the main application, namely the permission for extension of time and the permission to adduce fresh evidence, being allowed. The fresh evidence consisted of a 3D virtual reconstruction of the murder scene, which was said to be significant as it undermined the main eyewitness account. However, the court decided that this did not have probative value and had the risk to mislead a jury, as it did not take account of all the possible variants. So this fresh evidence was not admitted. The remainder of fresh evidence consisted of post-trial testimonies from various witnesses. However, the Court of Appeal deemed the testimonies lacking credibility and found them to be inconsistent. So the court found that Mr. Moore had failed to establish the grounds for an appeal based on fresh evidence and consequently rejected his application for an extension of time and for permission to adduce fresh evidence. Of note, it's the last paragraph in the Court of Appeal judgment which states, "Finally, we should mention that after the trial, the applicant's then lawyers wrote to the registrar to express their concern about the outcome, to indicate that, however, at that stage there were no arguable grounds of appeal, and to forewarn the registrar of the possibility of arguable grounds coming to light in the future." Obviously, such a letter does not dilute the requirements for an appeal to be mounted within the appropriate time limits, say the court, nor does it provide a platform for arguing an extension of time. We chose to mention this to highlight the unfairness of the system in cases like this, where the trial's outcome contradicts a person's actual innocence, yet leaves them powerless to submit an appeal based solely on innocence grounds. It shows that the system prioritizes procedural correctness over the actual truth of a person's guilt or innocence, as appealing a conviction typically requires demonstrating that there was a legal error during the trial, such as an improper jury instruction or mishandling of evidence, rather than simply proving one's innocence. Mr. Moore's conviction was therefore upheld. The Guardian reported on the 9th of October 2023 that Steve Hobbs, a retired Met detective superintendent who led more than 200 murder investigations, has been working on this case largely pro bono for the private detective agency TMI. He produced a 46-page dossier detailing flaws in the evidence against Moore in 2021 that was submitted to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. The report concluded that the conviction was completely unsafe and that the issues raised amounted to a compelling trend of evidence and intelligence that suggests Jason Moore did not stab Robert Darby. However, the CCRC rejected the application and refused to refer the case to the Court of Appeal. Yet Hobbs said he was never even contacted by the CCRC to discuss his investigation before they turned down the case. It was also revealed in March 2023 in an article by the Romford Recorder that the only identifying witness had been drunk at the time of the event. Dave McKelvey, who earned more than 60 commendations in his policing career, has been aiding the Free Jason Moore campaign pro bono for years through his TMI private investigation firm. He said Mr. Hammed's claim to have been drunk was hugely significant. There was already a massive question mark over the 2012 identification, he said, because how does he suddenly pick out someone completely different from the original identification? He suggested this could provide an explanation. If Ahmed was drunk, it should have been brought to the attention of the jury, said Mr. McKelvey. Someone's ability to be a credible witness has got to be based on the fact that they were sober and lucid and saw what they saw. Eyewitness evidence is unreliable at the best of times, said Mr. McKelvey, let alone if the witness had been drinking. It is understood that the witness told the police at the time that he was drunk, yet this was never disclosed to the court or the defense. Following the CCRC's rejection of Mr. Moore's application, there have been several demonstrations outside the Court of Appeal. The Oxford Mail, covering one of these demonstrations, reported Mr. Moore's mother's statement as follows: I think it will take public support to get Jason out because the authorities won't admit they had made a mistake. Mr. Moore's former partner added, we want the CCRC to open their ears and their eyes, read the evidence and hear our voices. What is striking in this case is that the family of Mr. Darby, the original victim as already mentioned, is supporting the Free Mr. Moore campaign. In the Guardian's article of the 9th of October 2023, to which we referred earlier, it was reported that Moore is not the only one protesting his innocence. Amongst those convinced he is not a murderer are the victim's family, several retired detectives from the Metropolitan Police, and a local bishop. Tim Darby, the victim's older brother, said investigations into his brother's death had been shambolic, and he was supporting Moore's campaign because he was convinced of his innocence. The Bishop of Stepney, Joanne Grenfell, said she was particularly compelled by the fact that both the Darby and Moore families were calling for his release. They all believe it's wrong, and that struck me as the most extraordinary coming together, she added. The Guardian also revealed that in its statement of reasoning for refusing the case, the CCRC said the two witnesses agreed it was the front seat passenger who attacked Darby. However, the only other witness did not pick Moore out of an identity parade and did not say she had seen anyone exiting a car. So how could she know he was the passenger? The Moore family said this inaccurate accurate summary of the evidence suggests that the CCRC did not properly investigate the case. These concerns were echoed in a more recent article on BBC News dated the 10th of August 2024, in which it was said that the Reverend Dr. Joanne Grenfell, at the wake of the new Lord Chancellor Shabana Mahmood stating that Helen Pitcher, head of the CCRC, was unable to fulfill her duties, argued there had been repeated failures by the CCRC in investigating potential miscarriages of justice, including in Moore's case. She wrote that in his case, these included lack of DNA evidence, the inconsistencies and unreliability of eyewitness testimony, and the failure to disclose key pieces of information to the defense. Other people of note supporting Mr. Moore's campaign include Bobby Cummines, OBE. They also include Kimberley Chambers, a best-selling crime author, Sir Ian Botham, an English cricket commentator, and John Ratomski, who runs Iron's Food Bank, a charity backed by West Ham FC, who all took part at an event held at the festival in aid of the Free Jason Moore's campaign on the 10th of August 2024. In light of the issues we have discussed in this two-part series, in particular, the CCRC's delayed response to Mr. Bamber's latest application, the failure of the CCRC to contact Mr. Hobbs, the retired detective who produced a 46-page dossier that formed the basis of Jason Moore's application to the CCRC, and the inaccuracies in the statement of reason that rejected Mr. Moore's application, can we now assert that we have a clearer understanding of the CCRC's failures in supporting victims of miscarriages of justice and its shortcomings in referring deserving cases to the Court of Appeal? I think we can confidently argue that these cases demonstrate that the CCRC is not fearlessly asking the right questions, rigorously analysing new evidence and submissions, and most importantly, accurately identifying the cases that deserve to be referred for further review. In short, the CCRC has fallen short of being the robust, well-resourced and mission-driven organisation that Mr. Helly KC said it should strive to be. If you would like to know more or support Mr. Bamber and or Mr. Moore's campaigns, I have provided the links to their respective campaign web pages in the description below. This concludes our two-part series. I hope you have found it both balanced and engaging, and if you haven't already, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Also, join our networking hub at spokeninjustice.net to have your say as to the future content of this channel. Join us again as we sit and rise in this unique trial.